Every criminal justice system in the world runs on the same basic promise. If you come forward, if you give us what we need, we will protect you. That promise is the foundation of every major prosecution, every cartel takedown, every case that puts a kingpin behind bars. The cartels understand that promise better than anyone. They have spent decades figuring out exactly how to break it. They infiltrate the police units protecting informants. They buy the officials handling the cases. They track phones, pull public records, follow cars, and wait. And when they find the person who talked, they make sure everyone watching understands what cooperation costs. The 10 people in this video trusted that promise. Some were federal agents, some were lawyers, some were ordinary people who answered questions at their front door and were dead within days. Some made it all the way to the courtroom. None of them survived what came after. Today we are covering 10 cartel informants killed before they could testify. Case 1. Enrique Camarena, DEA agent, Guadalajara Cartel, 1985. On the morning of February 7, 1985, Enrique Camarena stepped out of the U.S. consulate in Guadalajara, Mexico, heading to meet his wife for lunch. He never arrived. Within minutes of hitting the street, several men forced him into a waiting vehicle. His pilot, Alfredo Zavala Avelar, was grabbed from the Guadalajara airport the same morning. Both men were DEA assets. Both would spend the next 30 hours being tortured inside a cartel safe house. By February 9th, both were dead. Camarena was 37 years old. Camarena was born in Mexico on July 26, 1947, and later became a naturalized U.S. citizen. Before joining the DEA, he worked as a police officer in Fresno, California. By the early 1980s, he had transferred to the DEA office in Guadalajara, one of the most dangerous postings in the entire agency. DEA agents in Mexico had no arrest powers. Their job was to gather intelligence, build informant networks, and pass what they learned to Mexican authorities. Camarena was exceptionally good at that work. His colleagues later said nobody in the Guadalajara office came close to matching his ability to persuade someone to cooperate and hold their nerve doing it. The cartel controlling Guadalajara at the time was run by 3 men: Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, Rafael Caro Quintero, and Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo. Together, they operated massive marijuana and cocaine networks running across Mexico and into the United States, generating billions of dollars annually. The organization was deeply connected to corrupt government officials and had effectively purchased protection at multiple levels of Mexican law enforcement. In 1984, Camarena helped develop intelligence that led to one of the biggest drug seizures Mexico had ever seen. Acting on that information, 450 Mexican soldiers, backed by helicopters, raided Rancho Buffalo, a 2,500-acre marijuana plantation in Chihuahua, estimated to produce around $8 billion worth of product a year. The cartel lost an enormous amount of money in a single operation. Leadership immediately suspected a DEA informant had exposed the location. Suspicion landed on Camarena. By early 1985, the decision had been made. He was just 2 weeks away from a scheduled transfer back to San Diego when they took him off the street. Camarena was forced into a vehicle by multiple men, steps from the consulate. Zavala Avelar was taken from the airport around the same time. Both were driven to a house at 881 Lope de Vega in the Jardines del Bosque neighborhood of Guadalajara, a property owned by Caro Quintero. What happened inside that house over the next 30 hours was partially captured on audio tape. Camarena was interrogated about DEA operations, his sources, and upcoming investigations. When the interrogation ended, both men were executed. A forensic examination of Camarena's body found that his skull had been penetrated by a steel rebar. His ribs were broken. The bodies were wrapped in plastic, blindfolded, bound, and transported roughly 60 miles outside Guadalajara, where they were buried on a rural farm. Camarena had been missing for close to a month when the bodies were discovered in March 1985. The DEA launched Operation Allende, the largest homicide investigation in the agency's history at that point. A dedicated unit was sent to Mexico to run the manhunt. Investigators quickly identified Felix Gallardo, Caro Quintero, and Fonseca Carrillo as the primary architects of the kidnapping and murder. The investigation also implicated the former director of the Mexican Federal Judicial Police and the former head of Interpol in Mexico. Under sustained U.S. pressure, Mexican authorities moved fast. Caro Quintero and Fonseca Carrillo were arrested within weeks. Felix Gallardo had stronger political cover and stayed free for another 4 years before finally being arrested in 1989. All three were tried in Mexican courts and convicted of participating in the kidnapping and murder of Camarena. Each received a 40-year sentence. Caro Quintero served 28 years before a Mexican appellate court released him in 2013 on a legal technicality, ruling that his case had been incorrectly tried in federal rather than state court. He immediately disappeared. He was recaptured by Mexican forces in July 2022. In February 2025, Caro Quintero was extradited to the United States as part of a large transfer of cartel figures, arraigned in New York on charges including the murder of Camarena, and entered a plea of not guilty. Camarena's family spent 40 years without seeing a single one of his killers face a U.S. courtroom. In March 2025, his widow, Geneva Camarena, and their sons filed a federal civil lawsuit in San Diego against Caro Quintero, Fonseca Carrillo, Felix Gallardo, and the Sinaloa cartel, seeking to hold them liable under U.S. terrorism law following the Trump administration's designation of multiple Mexican cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. His sister Myra, who had also worked for the DEA, said their mother died without ever seeing his killer brought to a U.S. court. Camarena's son is now a Superior Court judge in San Diego. A building at the DEA's San Diego field office is named after his father. Every DEA agent who graduates the academy receives a red ribbon in his memory. Camarena's murder did not stop the cartels. It reorganized them. The pressure that Operation Allende put on the Guadalajara network forced a restructuring of Mexican trafficking operations, one that ultimately gave rise to more compartmentalized, harder-to-dismantle organizations like the Sinaloa cartel. The men who killed Kiki Camarena accidentally built the blueprint for every major cartel that came after them. Barry Seal's story begins in Louisiana with a very different kind of man. Not a federal agent, but a cocaine smuggler who flew drugs for Escobar before flipping sides. What the Medellin cartel did to him after they found out shows that no amount of nerve or charisma can protect you once the wrong people know your name. Case 2. Barry Seal, Medellin Cartel Informant, Baton Rouge, 1986. Adler. Barry Seal grew up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and took his first solo flight at 15 years old. By the time he was in his early 40s, he had become one of the most prolific cocaine smugglers in American history, flying multi-ton loads for Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel, earning as much as $500,000 per flight. He was also, by the time he died, the most important government informant the DEA had ever used. He knew that combination was going to get him killed. He went ahead anyway. Seal had been flying since he was a teenager and understood aircraft in a way that made him genuinely valuable to smuggling networks. He moved between legitimate aviation work and criminal operations throughout the 1960s and 1970s, eventually building a relationship with the Medellin cartel that turned him into a primary transport link between Colombia and the United States. He flew cocaine north in large loads, parachuting bundled kilos over Louisiana bayous and landing on private strips across the South. The cartel knew him only by an alias, Ellis Mackenzie. They had no idea who he actually was. That changed in 1983 when Seal was arrested on drug charges. Facing a decade in federal prison, he made a decision that most people in his position did not survive. He approached the DEA and offered to cooperate, claiming he could deliver information on the inner workings of the Medellin cartel that no outside agent could possibly obtain. The DEA agreed. On March 28, 1984, Seal signed a formal letter making him an official government informant. U.S. Attorney Richard Gregory later testified that Seal was so valuable that many drug trafficking convictions could not have been obtained without him. What Seal gave the DEA in exchange for reduced charges was extraordinary. He flew to Colombia and then to Nicaragua, where he secretly photographed Pablo Escobar and Nicaraguan government officials helping load 1,200 kilograms of cocaine onto a military transport plane at the Managua airport. Those photographs gave U.S. prosecutors direct evidence against Escobar and Jorge Ochoa, two of the most wanted men in the world. Federal grand juries indicted both men. Jorge Ochoa was subsequently arrested in Spain, and extradition proceedings began. Seal was going to be the star witness that put him on trial in Miami. Then his cover was blown. In November 1984, a Baton Rouge television station aired a documentary that featured Seal's face on camera. The cartel saw it. Ellis Mackenzie was Barry's Seal. The men he had been flying cocaine for now knew exactly who had been feeding information to the DEA. Escobar and Fabio Ochoa personally authorized a contract on him. $500,000 to kill him, $1 million to bring him back alive to Colombia. Max Mermelstein, a high-level cartel distributor in Miami, was given the contract and accepted it out of fear for his own family. Before Mermelstein could act, he was arrested in June 1985 and became a government witness himself, immediately informing the DEA that a murder contract existed on Seal. Seal was told. He did not enter witness protection. He refused to. A federal judge in Louisiana, frustrated that a federal court had reduced his sentence, sentenced Seal to serve 6 months of his probation at a Salvation Army halfway house on Airline Highway in Baton Rouge, requiring him to be at that specific address every night between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. His lawyer later said the judge had effectively signed Seal's death warrant, publishing his exact location in public court documents every single night for 6 months. Seal was prohibited from carrying a weapon or having armed bodyguards as a condition of his release. On the evening of February 19, 1986, 3 Colombian hitmen hired by the Medellin cartel waited in the parking lot of the Salvation Army Center. When Seal pulled his white Cadillac into the lot, one of the men walked up and opened fire with a suppressed MAC-10 submachine gun. Seal was hit 6 times, in the chest, neck, and head. He was dead before anyone could reach him. He was 46 years old. 6 Colombians were arrested in connection with the murder. 3. Miguel Velez, Luis Carlos Quintero Cruz, and Bernardo Vasquez went to trial in Lake Charles, Louisiana in April 1987. The venue had been moved from Baton Rouge because pre-trial publicity had made it impossible to seat an impartial jury. Max Mermelstein testified that Escobar, Fabio Ochoa, and a third cartel member named Rafael Cardona Salazar had authorized and funded the hit. All 3 triggermen were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. The murder accomplished exactly what it was designed to do. With Seal dead, the extradition case against Jorge Ochoa in Spain collapsed. Ochoa was never brought to the United States to stand trial. He eventually surrendered to Colombian authorities in 1991, served a reduced sentence, and was later extradited to the U.S. in 2001 on a separate cocaine trafficking charge, but only on the condition that he could not be prosecuted for crimes committed before 1997, which put Seal's killing beyond reach. Fabio Ochoa, accused of co-authorizing the murder, was released from U.S. federal prison in December 2024 and deported to Colombia, where authorities let him walk free at the airport. Seal's DEA handler, Agent Richard Martinez, was named Agent of the Year in 2011. Years later, when asked about his role in Seal's death, he slumped in his chair and said he would rather not answer the question. The unnamed Colombian informant in our next case never got the chance to say anything at all. The cartel found out who he was before he could testify, and Mexico's most senior law enforcement official allegedly handed him over. Case 3. The unnamed Colombian DEA informant. Beltran Leyva Organization, Mexico, 2007 to 2008. For roughly 6 consecutive months between 2007 and 2008, something kept going wrong for the Beltran Leyva organization. The cartel was one of the most powerful drug trafficking operations in Mexico at the time, run by 5 brothers, Arturo, Marcos, Carlos, Alfredo, Hector, who had spent years building a cocaine pipeline that ran from Colombia through Mexico and into the United States. Their Colombian suppliers would move the product by sea to international waters off the Mexican coast, where Beltran Leyva powerboats and submarines would collect it and bring it to shore. It was a system that had worked smoothly for years. Then, shipment after shipment started getting intercepted by the DEA. The cocaine was seized, the loads were lost, and the money that should have come back never came. The brothers were losing an enormous amount of product in a way that had no obvious explanation. Arturo Beltran Leyva was the most powerful of the brothers and the cartel's operational head. He concluded the obvious. There was an informant inside the operation. Someone had access to the shipment details. Someone was talking. He ordered his people to find out who. He also reached out to someone with the ability to access information that street-level cartel members could not. A man positioned at the very top of Mexican law enforcement. Genaro Garcia Luna served as Mexico's Secretary of Public Security under President Felipe Calderón from 2006 to 2012. He oversaw the country's entire federal police apparatus, commanded thousands of officers, and was the primary Mexican counterpart for U.S. drug enforcement agencies, including the DEA and FBI. American officials treated him as one of the most important allies in the fight against the cartels. He attended meetings with senior U.S. officials, received training and intelligence from the DEA, and presented himself publicly as the man leading Mexico's war on drugs. According to testimony later presented at his federal trial in Brooklyn, he was simultaneously taking millions of dollars from the cartels he was supposed to be dismantling, allegedly receiving as much as $6 million from the Sinaloa cartel and $50 million from the Beltran Leyva organization over the course of his time in office. Garcia Luna's trial began in January 2023 in a federal courthouse in Brooklyn, New York. He was charged with collaborating with the Sinaloa and Beltran Leyva cartels and with engaging in a continuing criminal enterprise. Among the testimony presented in court was an account of what happened to the DEA informant. The testimony came from 2 former high-ranking cartel members who had themselves been extradited to the United States and cooperated with prosecutors: Sergio Villarreal Barragán, known as El Grande, and a second witness known as La Reina. According to El Grande's testimony, the DEA had arrested a Colombian man in Miami and then released him specifically to work as an inside source, providing information on drug shipments moving through the Beltran Leyva network. The informant had access to operational details, enough to explain the string of cocaine seizures that had been bleeding the cartel dry for months. When the cartel went looking for an explanation, they turned to Garcia Luna. El Grande testified that a senior federal police official, Luis Cardenas Palomino, one of Garcia Luna's co-defendants, accessed the informant's identity through a Mexican federal police officer stationed in Colombia. That information was brought to a meeting attended by cartel leadership and high-ranking federal police officials. Someone walked into that meeting carrying a cardboard binder. Inside it was a photograph of the Colombian informant and everything the cartel needed to identify him. Arturo Beltran Leyva saw the photograph. He gave the order immediately. 2 high-ranking Beltran Leyva lieutenants were sent to carry it out. They found the Colombian informant in a city in central Mexico, kidnapped him, and began torturing him. During the interrogation, the informant admitted that he had been arrested in Miami and that he had been cooperating with the DEA. After that admission, he was killed. Garcia Luna denied all charges against him. His defense team worked to challenge the credibility of the cartel witnesses who testified against him, pointing to inconsistencies in their prior statements to authorities. The witnesses themselves were not neutral parties. They were convicted drug traffickers who had committed serious crimes and were cooperating in exchange for sentencing consideration. That is a standard feature of organized crime prosecutions, where the people who know the most about what happened inside a criminal organization are, by definition, people who were inside it. The jury in Brooklyn was not persuaded by the defense. In February 2023, Genaro Garcia Luna was convicted on all charges. He was found guilty of drug trafficking conspiracy and engaging in a continuing criminal enterprise. He faced a mandatory minimum sentence of life in prison. The man who had run Mexico's federal police, shaken hands with U.S. secretaries of state, and publicly declared war on the cartels, was going to spend the rest of his life in an American prison. The Colombian informant whose death was central to that trial was never publicly named. No official accounting of who he was, where he came from, or whether he had a family waiting for him has ever been released. What is known is that he took an enormous personal risk by cooperating with the DEA, that the information he provided was significant enough for the cartel to spend months hunting for the source of it, and that the system he trusted to protect him failed him completely. Not by accident, but because the man at the top of that system was on the cartel's payroll. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Jose Daniel Gonzalez Galeana trusted a different system, U.S. law enforcement on American soil, and believed that putting distance between himself and Mexico would be enough to keep him safe. He was wrong, and the man sent to kill him was someone who had been working for the same government Gonzalez was cooperating with. Case 4. Jose Daniel Gonzalez Galeana, Juarez Cartel Informant, El Paso, 2009. Jose Daniel Gonzalez Galeana was 37 years old, a lieutenant in the Juarez cartel, and a father living with his wife and children on a quiet cul-de-sac in one of the more expensive residential neighborhoods in El Paso, Texas. On May 15, 2009, he was shot 8 times outside his front door. The man who coordinated his murder was also a U.S. government informant. The teenager who pulled the trigger was a serving U.S. Army soldier. Law enforcement experts described it at the time as the first assassination of a ranking cartel member carried out on American soil, a threshold the cartels had not previously crossed, and one that most officials had believed would hold. Gonzalez had worked for years as a lieutenant inside the Juarez cartel, overseeing smuggling operations that moved drugs across the Texas border. He was a legal immigrant, By the time he surfaced in El Paso, he had already begun cooperating with U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, providing information about cartel activity in exchange for a visa that allowed him and his family to stay in the United States. His neighbors on the cul-de-sac later told reporters the family was quiet and pleasant. His children played outside with the kids next door. Nobody on that street had any idea who he was. El Paso Police Chief Greg Allen lived directly behind his house and heard the gunshots from his backyard. The sequence that led to Gonzalez being marked for death started with the arrest in Mexico of Pedro Aranas Sanchez, known as El Tigre, a Juarez cartel lieutenant. After that arrest, Gonzalez abruptly vanished from Mexico and resurfaced in El Paso. His sudden disappearance, combined with the raid on a cartel warehouse that followed, made other cartel members suspicious. Then a Mexican newspaper published his name, identifying him directly as an informant connected to El Tigre's arrest. ICE had also issued Gonzalez a visa, a fact that cartel members in Mexico noted and interpreted as confirmation. Court documents filed later stated that Gonzalez was aware of what was coming. He told a witness he would be killed if certain people found him. He knew exactly how this worked. He just had no way out of it. The man assigned to track him down was Ruben Rodriguez Dorado, a fellow mid-level Juarez cartel member who was himself simultaneously working as a confidential informant for ICE. Rodriguez had been ordered by cartel lieutenant Jesus Aguayo Salas to locate Gonzalez and arrange his execution. Rodriguez told investigators later that his job inside the cartel had been to coordinate surveillance, following intended victims until they could be killed. He tracked Gonzalez to a relative's home in Canutillo, Texas, and followed him back to his house on the night of May 15th. To carry out the actual shooting, Rodriguez recruited two people with no cartel membership: Private First Class Michael Jackson Apodaca, 18 years old, stationed at nearby Fort Bliss Army Base and attached to the 11th Air Defense Artillery Brigade, and Christopher Duran, 17 years old. Apodaca was paid $5,000, nearly 3 times his monthly military salary, to be the triggerman. Duran drove the getaway car. Rodriguez, Apodaca, and Duran followed Gonzalez from his relative's home in Canutillo back to his house. A witness reported hearing an argument in Spanish shortly before the shooting. Gonzalez was standing outside his 2-story home when Apodaca opened fire. 8 bullets, close range. Police Chief Allen, who lived steps away, described it as a deliberate, up-close execution, carried out in a way that made the message impossible to miss. El Paso police launched a murder investigation. Federal agencies were called in. The shooting had taken place on American soil, in a residential neighborhood, steps from the city's top law enforcement official. Phone records placed Rodriguez, Apodaca, and Duran at the scene. Investigators connected them through calls made to a tactical supply store that exclusively sold the same brand of ammunition found at the scene. A call Rodriguez made the day of the killing. Rodriguez, Apodaca, and Duran were arrested on August 10, 2009, and charged with capital murder. A 16-year-old boy involved in reconnaissance was arrested 2 days later and charged as a juvenile. A warrant was issued for Aguayo Salas, the cartel lieutenant who had ordered and funded the hit. During interrogation, Rodriguez told investigators he had coordinated the murder on Aguayo's orders. Apodaca and Duran both admitted to investigators they had been paid to participate. The revelation that Rodriguez was himself an ICE informant caused a serious breakdown in relations between El Paso police and federal agencies. Police Chief Allen said he had been given no information about dangerous cartel informants living in his jurisdiction. He met twice with ICE officials to formally complain, telling them directly that future cooperation from his department depended on federal agencies keeping local law enforcement informed. ICE declined to publicly comment on either informant's status. Apodaca was convicted and sentenced to life in prison on July 25, 2011, in El Paso District Court. He had been paid $5,000 to end a man's life in front of his own home. Duran and Rodriguez were also prosecuted. Aguayo Salas, the cartel lieutenant who ordered the hit from Mexico, remained a fugitive. The shooting changed the calculus around cartel violence inside the United States. It demonstrated that Mexican trafficking organizations were both willing and operationally capable of executing people they considered traitors on American soil, using a combination of their own members, recruited civilians, and, in this case, an active-duty military serviceman. ICE had known Gonzalez was being hunted by the cartel when they gave him the visa that brought him to El Paso. He died on the cul-de-sac they helped put him on. The man in our next case wasn't a cartel member who switched sides. He was a trained Mexican federal police commander, hand-picked and funded by the United States, who spent years feeding cartel leaders the names of the very informants he was trusted to protect. Case 5. The unnamed DEA informant, Iván Reyes Arzate / Beltran Leyva Organization, Mexico, 2009. Iván Reyes Arzate was not a cartel member who flipped. He was not a drug runner, a money launderer, or someone who got caught and cut a deal. He was a senior Mexican federal police commander, the head of a unit the DEA itself had created, funded, trained, and trusted with some of its most sensitive operational intelligence. He attended seminars at the DEA Academy in Quantico, Virginia. He shook hands with American agents who believed he was on their side. For years, he used that access to do the opposite of his job. He fed the cartels the identities of informants, tipped off surveillance targets when their phones were being tapped, and attended a cartel meeting in 2009 where he unmasked a DEA source in exchange for a share of a $3 million payment. That source was kidnapped, tortured, and killed. The unit Reyes commanded was called the Sensitive Investigative Unit, known as the SIU. The DEA created SIUs across Mexico, specifically because ordinary Mexican law enforcement had been so thoroughly compromised by cartel money that American agents couldn't trust them with anything important. The idea was to handpick officers, subject them to additional vetting, train them at U.S. facilities, and give them access to intelligence that rank-and-file officers would never see. In theory, the SIU was the solution to the corruption problem. In practice, at least in this case, the DEA had handed its most sensitive information to a man who was working against them. Reyes had built a career that looked impeccable from the outside. He had overseen operations that resulted in the arrests of numerous high-level cartel members and associates across Mexico, including members of the Sinaloa cartel who faced charges in Chicago. Those results gave him credibility and deepened the DEA's trust in him. The more he appeared to deliver, the more access he received. American agents briefed him on wiretap operations, shared the identities of confidential sources, and treated him as a key partner in one of the most sensitive drug enforcement relationships in the world. Sometime in 2009, the Beltran Leyva organization, at that point one of the most powerful cartels in Mexico, convened a meeting in Cuernavaca. Arturo Beltran Leyva, the cartel's operational leader, was the central figure. Reyes Arzate attended, along with other corrupt officials. The cartel had been hunting for the identity of a DEA informant who had provided intelligence that resulted in Arturo Beltran Leyva being federally indicted in Chicago. That informant was described in later court documents as having been instrumental in securing the indictment. At the Cuernavaca meeting, Reyes Arzate provided what the cartel needed. He identified the informant. In exchange, he received a share of a $3 million payment. The informant was located, kidnapped, and tortured. The Beltran Leyva organization wanted to know everything the informant had told U.S. authorities before they killed him. After the interrogation, he was executed. His name has never been publicly released. No official accounting of who he was has been made available. What is known is that he was working inside one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in Mexico, feeding intelligence to the DEA, and that the only reason the cartel found him was because the man the DEA had trusted to protect that kind of information sold him out for money. Reyes continued operating. Beyond unmasking the informant at the 2009 meeting, he also warned cartel-connected individuals when they became targets of DEA surveillance. In one documented instance, he told a former Beltran Leyva cartel member who was being monitored, "They know you are here, and they want to see who you hang out with. Don't talk at all." Investigators later obtained wire intercepts in which the leader of another drug cartel explicitly referred to Ivan by name during a conversation with an associate, discussing information that had clearly come from inside the DEA's operational circle and could only have reached the cartel through Reyes. The DEA began connecting the dots when information collected through wiretaps started matching details that had only been shared with Reyes. He was the sole Mexican point of contact for certain intelligence streams that were being compromised. In February 2017, DEA agents confronted Reyes at the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City. He denied having leaked anything to the cartels. He acknowledged that he was the only person in Mexico who had access to the specific information that was being compromised. The criminal complaint against him was filed in February 2017 and unsealed in April of that year. It ran to 43 pages. Reyes Arzate was convicted in Chicago federal court in 2018 on charges of conspiracy to corruptly influence and impede an official proceeding. The conviction confirmed what the DEA's own architecture had made possible, that by concentrating access to sensitive intelligence in a single unit and trusting that unit's commander without adequate oversight, they had created a direct pipeline from their operations into the hands of the cartels they were trying to dismantle. Arturo Beltran Leyva, the man who ordered the informant's death and who had paid Reyes for his identity, was killed in a Mexican Navy raid in Cuernavaca in December 2009, the same city where the 2009 meeting had taken place. The DEA informant whose identity he purchased that day had already been dead for months by the time Beltran Leyva was cornered. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Allende massacre in our next case shows what happens when the same kind of institutional failure plays out at a catastrophic scale, where a DEA leak does not kill one person, but triggers a 3-day cartel rampage through an entire Mexican town that may have claimed as many as 300 lives. Case 6. The Allende Massacre, Los Zetas, Coahuila, Mexico, 2011. In the Dallas suburbs, the DEA had stumbled onto something significant. During a routine traffic stop, agents found $802,000 in cash vacuum-packed inside a gas tank. The driver confessed it belonged to Miguel and Omar Trevino, two brothers who ran the most feared enforcement arm in Los Zetas, known inside the cartel as Z40 and Z42. The U.S. government had been hunting the Trevinos for years. Now, they had leverage, and they intended to use it. The agent who led the Dallas operation was Richard Martinez, working the case under a DEA initiative called Operation Too Legit to Quit. Martinez identified a Zetas-connected operative named Jose Vasquez Jr., who had ties to Texas and was vulnerable to pressure. The DEA threatened to imprison Vasquez's wife and mother, who were living in Texas, if he did not cooperate. Vasquez agreed. What Martinez wanted from him was specific: the trackable BlackBerry PIN numbers of the Trevino brothers' phones. Those numbers would allow the DEA to follow the brothers' movements in real time. Vasquez got them by approaching Héctor Moreno, a Zetas lieutenant, and using his own leverage. Moreno's brother, Gilberto, had been caught driving the cash-filled truck and had confessed to working for the Trevinos. Vasquez promised Moreno that nobody else in the cartel would find out what Gilberto had said. Moreno handed over the pins. Martinez then passed the phone tracking information to a DEA supervisor in Mexico City, who shared it with a Mexican federal police unit. That unit had a documented reputation for leaking sensitive information to criminal organizations. At least one DEA agent had warned his superiors before the handover not to trust that unit. The warning was not heeded. Within a short time, the Trevino brothers knew their phones had been compromised. They knew someone had given the DEA access to their communications. Given the small number of people who had known those PIN numbers, tracing the source back to Allende, a quiet ranching town of roughly 23,000 people, 40 minutes from Eagle Pass, Texas, was not difficult. Both Vasquez and Moreno had deep family ties there. The Treviños concluded the leak had come from that town. Both Vasquez and Garza, after learning what was coming, fled across the border into the United States and cooperated with American law enforcement, leaving Allende to absorb what was heading its way. On the evening of March 18, 2011, dozens of armed Zetas gunmen began moving into Allende and the surrounding area. What followed lasted 3 days. The cartel targeted families connected, even remotely, to the men they believed had betrayed them, focusing on households sharing the surnames Garza, Gaitan, Moreno, and Villanueva. 40 homes and 7 ranches were looted and burned. Heavy machinery was used to demolish some structures. People were dragged from their houses, pulled from vehicles, and taken from the streets. The 089 emergency system in Allende and the neighboring city of Piedras Negras received 1,451 calls for help during the initial days of the attack. Not one was answered. Municipal police, who had long been operating under Zeta's control, took an active role in the disappearances rather than responding to them. One witness told investigators the local police director had instructed officers to do nothing and say nothing. Victims were transported to the Luis Garza ranch outside town. There, they were killed and their bodies incinerated in large barrels filled with diesel fuel and caustic soda, a method the Zetas used to eliminate physical evidence of their killings entirely. What remained were ash, fragments of bone, teeth, and scattered personal belongings. Shoes, medications, wedding invitations, children's toys mixed into the rubble of demolished houses. Coahuila state authorities initially estimated approximately 28 people had been killed. Families of victims said from the beginning that the true number was far higher. A 2017 investigation by ProPublica and National Geographic, based on months of interviews and document review, confirmed at least 60 deaths and disappearances directly connected to the attack. A subsequent report, led by Mexican human rights researcher Sergio Aguayo and published by the Colegio de Mexico, suggested the total could approach 300. The Mexican government did not publicly acknowledge the massacre had occurred until 2014, 3 years after it happened. State authorities in Coahuila eventually launched what they described as a major investigation, which victims' families characterized as inadequate. No conclusive DNA accounting of the dead was ever produced. No final official tally of the missing was ever released. Fewer than a dozen suspects were arrested in the years that followed, most of them low-level cartel members and former local police who had carried out orders. Nobody was charged with murder. American courts moved differently. Hugo Cesar Roman Chavarria, known as El Vecino, was a senior Zetas figure who had overseen cocaine shipments between Piedras Negras and Eagle Pass throughout the period of the massacre. He was extradited to the United States in November 2018. During a 3-day sentencing hearing in 2021 in the Eastern District of Texas, 13 witnesses testified against him, including other extradited former Zetas commanders. The massacre was entered into evidence. On September 13, 2021, U.S. District Judge Sean Jordan sentenced Roman Chavarria to life in prison for drug trafficking conspiracy. Richard Martinez, the DEA agent whose decision to share the tracking information with a compromised Mexican police unit set the massacre in motion, was named the DEA's Agent of the Year in 2011, the same year Allende burned. He later spoke to ProPublica about his role, briefly choking up before saying he would rather not answer the question. Juan Jesus Guerrero Chapa, in our next case, was not a cartel foot soldier or an operational asset. He was a lawyer who had sat in boardrooms with the leaders of one of Mexico's most powerful criminal organizations, and when he became an informant, the cartel spent 2 years and $1 million hunting him down inside the United States. Case 7. Juan Jesus Guerrero Chapa, Gulf Cartel attorney, South Lake, Texas, 2013. Juan Jesus Guerrero Chapa was 43 years old, a Mexican lawyer, and by the evening of May 22, 2013, had been running from the same people for 2 years. He was living legally in South Lake, Texas, one of the wealthiest suburbs in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, in a home valued at $1.2 million with his wife and 2 teenage children. He had done everything he could think of to disappear. He moved house after a threat. He changed his routines. He stayed close to his family. At 6:47 p.m. that evening, while his wife loaded shopping bags into the trunk of their Range Rover in the parking lot of South Lake Town Square, a white Toyota Sequoia pulled up behind them. A masked gunman stepped out, walked to Guerrero's side of the car, and shot him multiple times with a 9mm pistol through the window. Guerrero died at the scene. His wife was feet away and was not harmed. It was the first homicide in South Lake in 14 years. Guerrero had spent years as the personal attorney to Ociel Cardenas Guillen, the founder and boss of the Gulf Cartel, one of the most violent and powerful drug trafficking organizations in Mexico. Cardenas was arrested by Mexican authorities in 2003 after a standoff with the military, and it was widely understood that he continued running cartel operations from inside a Mexican prison. Guerrero's legal work put him at the center of one of the most dangerous criminal enterprises in North America, with direct access to leadership, financial structures, and organizational intelligence that few people outside the cartel ever saw. When Cardenas was extradited to the United States in 2007, Guerrero eventually became a confidential informant for U.S. Homeland Security investigations. The same agency, part of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that investigates cross-border drug trafficking. He and his family were allowed to live legally in Texas while he cooperated. The cartel world Guerrero had inhabited for years was built entirely on loyalty and the punishment of betrayal. His enemies were not abstract. The man who ordered his death was José Rodolfo Villarreal Hernandez, known as El Gato, the Cat, a senior figure in the Beltran Leyva cartel and a man with a personal grievance. El Gato believed that Guerrero was responsible for the death of his father. Testimony presented at the subsequent federal trial described El Gato's determination to settle that score as consuming. He was willing to spend whatever it took and wait as long as necessary. In early 2011, someone called Guerrero with a warning. People had found him, the caller said. They were going to kill him. Guerrero and his family left their home in Grapevine, Texas that same day and never went back. They moved in with a relative before eventually relocating to South Lake. 2 years later, in 2013, a second warning came. The family began staying intermittently at nearby hotels. His wife testified at trial that her husband received that second call and they started moving around again, trying to reduce their exposure. On the day he was killed, he and his wife had driven to South Lake Town Square to run ordinary errands, to get ice cream and do some shopping. Ledesma Campano, one of the men sent to track him, testified that he and his co-conspirators were parked nearby, watching through binoculars, when Guerrero pulled into his regular parking spot near a yogurt store. El Gato had contracted a private investigator from Monterrey named Jesus Gerardo Ledesma Cepeda to find Guerrero. Ledesma Cepeda brought in his son, Jesus Gerardo Ledesma Campano, and a cousin, José Luis Cepeda Cortés. Over a period running from approximately March 2011 to May 22, 2013, the three men made repeated trips from Mexico into the United States, using public records searches, vehicle registration databases, GPS tracking devices, and surveillance to locate and monitor Guerrero and his family. They created shared email accounts so El Gato could communicate with them directly during the operation. According to trial testimony, El Gato spent approximately $1 million on the tracking operation in total. Once Guerrero was located and his movements mapped, El Gato sent two assassins from Mexico, known during the trial only by their operational names, Clorox and Captain. Ledesma Campano met them and confirmed they were there to carry out the killing. On the day of the murder, Ledesma Campano and his father followed Guerrero to South Lake Town Square. While Guerrero's Range Rover was briefly parked at a nearby Walmart earlier that afternoon, the men switched the GPS tracker on his vehicle to ensure they would not lose him. After the shooting, the tracking team returned to Mexico. El Gato, according to Ledesma Campano's testimony, hosted a celebration. He told the men his father could now rest in peace. He bought Ledesma Cepeda a BMW. He organized a lengthy hunting trip as a reward. Clorox and Captain, the actual shooter and driver, were never identified or arrested and remain at large. The three men who tracked Guerrero were tried in federal court in Fort Worth in April and May 2016. Ledesma Campano had pleaded guilty before trial and testified for the prosecution. His father and cousin were convicted of interstate stalking and conspiracy to commit murder for hire. Ledesma Campano was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Both his father and Cepeda Cortés were sentenced to life. El Gato was placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list in October 2020. A reward of $1 million was offered for information leading to his arrest. He was captured in Mexico City in January 2023 and was among 29 cartel figures extradited to the United States in February 2025 under the Trump administration's cartel crackdown. He is being prosecuted in the Northern District of Texas. Guerrero had lived with a death sentence hanging over him for 2 years and knew it. The system that was supposed to protect him never told the people around him who he really was or what was closing in. 7. Cesar Murio and Myra Hernandez, in our next case, were not cartel members at all. They were ordinary people in Yakima, Washington, who spoke to federal agents and were dead within days. Case 8. Cesar Murio and Myra Sofia Hernandez, Sinaloa-linked cell, Yakima, Washington, 2022. Cesar Armando Murio was 44 years old, a father of 2. Myra Sofia Hernandez was 33, a mother of 3, and 6 months pregnant. Both lived in Yakima, Washington, an agricultural city in the center of the state, better known for apple orchards than cartel violence. On consecutive days in late August 2022, federal agents from Homeland Security Investigations knocked on their doors and asked them questions about a drug smuggling operation running through the San Diego border. Within days of those interviews, both Murio and Hernandez were dead. Their bodies were buried in the high desert outside Yakima. It took investigators more than a year to find them. The operation that brought federal attention to Yakima had started on the other side of the country. Between August and October 2021, HSI agents in San Diego began seizing drugs from late-model stolen vehicles passing through area ports of entry. The vehicles were well chosen, newer, less likely to draw suspicion, harder to immediately flag. The drugs recovered included methamphetamine, cocaine, and fentanyl. As agents worked back through phone records, financial transfers, and vehicle registrations, the trail led them inland to a group of people in Yakima. At the center of that group was Benjamin Madrigal Birueta, 22 years old, an undocumented Mexican national from the state of Jalisco, who had come to the United States in late 2020. He had worked construction as a roofer in Phoenix, Portland, and Fresno before being recruited into the trafficking cell. By early 2022, after one of the group's leaders died, Madrigal had taken on a leadership role. After killing Murio, he took full control. Murio and Hernandez were connected to the smuggling group through wire transfers and vehicle registrations that agents had traced during the investigation. In late August 2022, HSI agents interviewed both of them on consecutive days. Neither was in custody. Neither had been charged. They were witnesses, not defendants. The interviews happened. Madrigal found out. On August 28, 2022, Madrigal and co-conspirators lured Murio to a ranch on the outskirts of Yakima. At the ranch, they shot him multiple times in the back of the head and torso. Madrigal later told investigators he acted in self-defense, claiming Murio had fired at him and his associates first, though he acknowledged none of them were struck by any gunfire. Federal prosecutors described the account as an admission dressed up as justification. Less than a week later, Madrigal called Hernandez. He told her that Murio was at the ranch and wanted to see her. She was visibly pregnant. She got in the car with Madrigal, who drove her out to the same location. When they arrived, co-conspirators shot her multiple times in the head. One bullet remained lodged in her lung. Two forensic pathologists later examined her remains independently and reached the same conclusion about cause of death. Madrigal directed the men to bury both bodies at the ranch. The unborn child Hernandez was carrying died with her. She was 6 months along. Then Madrigal's crew went quiet. Murio and Hernandez were simply gone. When agents returned to Yakima with search warrants on September 8, 2022, they found dozens of firearms at a Yakima residence and the ranch, including high-powered rifles and a machine gun, but no sign of the two people they had interviewed days earlier. The investigation shifted. Agents now had a drug trafficking case and what appeared to be a double homicide. The problem was they had no bodies and no confirmed location. What followed was one of the most technically intensive search operations in recent federal memory. Investigators deployed geophysicists, ground-penetrating radar, aircraft, laser imaging technology, chemical soil testing, and numerous cadaver dogs across the high desert terrain surrounding Yakima. The search ran for more than a year. In September 2023, the remains were finally located and exhumed by a Washington State Police forensic evidence team. The bodies had been in the ground for 12 months. Madrigal was arrested in March 2023 on the outskirts of Fresno, California, where he had been living. He was 22 years old at the time of his arrest. During that arrest, he admitted to investigators that he had overseen drug smugglers caught at the San Diego and Tijuana border crossing, admitted to shooting Murio, and told agents where the bodies were buried, information that still took another 6 months and an extensive search operation to act on, given the remoteness of the site. Ricardo Orizaba, 21, was charged as an accessory after the fact to murder. Both were ordered detained pending trial. In March 2024, a superseding indictment was unsealed in the Southern District of California, formally charging Madrigal with 2 counts of murder in furtherance of a drug trafficking conspiracy, and a separate count for the death of Hernandez's unborn child. U.S. Attorney Tara McGrath described the killings as executions designed to silence witnesses and instill fear. In September 2025, Madrigal pleaded guilty to all 3 counts. He is scheduled to be sentenced. Hernandez is survived by her 3 minor children. Murio is survived by his 2. The case established something blunt and important. Cartel-connected trafficking organizations operating entirely inside the United States were willing to hunt down and execute people who talked to federal agents, bury the evidence in the desert, and go about their business. The border was not a meaningful boundary for that kind of retaliation. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The informant in our next case never had the chance to run or hide. The Sinaloa cartel's enforcement arm found out who he was, assembled a kidnapping team, and killed him along with 8 other people, including a 13-year-old boy, before anyone could intervene. Case 9. The Unnamed DEA Confidential Source. Sinaloa Cartel/Chapitos, Mexico, 2023. In October 2023, a DEA confidential source was kidnapped in Mexico along with 10 other people. 8 of the 11 were killed. One of the dead was a 13-year-old boy. The man charged with ordering and carrying out those killings was Nestor Isidro Perez Salas, known as El Nini, the commander of the primary enforcement and security apparatus for the Chapitos, the faction of the Sinaloa cartel run by the sons of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. According to federal prosecutors, the entire operation was retaliation. The confidential source had been providing information to law enforcement that was being used in an active federal investigation against Perez Salas and his associates in the Southern District of New York. When Perez Salas found out, he did not run or go quiet. He dispatched a kidnapping team. The Chapitos, Ivan Archivaldo Guzman Salazar and Jesus Alfredo Guzman Salazar, took control of a major faction of the Sinaloa cartel after their father El Chapo was extradited to the United States in 2017 and convicted in 2019. They built their operation around fentanyl production and distribution at a scale that federal authorities described as responsible for a substantial portion of the synthetic opioid flooding into the United States. To protect that operation, they maintained a security apparatus made up of armed enforcers whose job was to identify threats, neutralize rivals, and eliminate anyone who cooperated with law enforcement. Perez Salas commanded that apparatus. His group was called the Ninis, Mexican slang for young people who neither work nor study, and under his leadership, it became one of the most violent enforcement units operating inside any cartel structure in Mexico. Perez Salas had been building a record of extreme violence for years before the 2023 kidnappings. According to court documents filed in the Southern District of New York, in 2017, he and 2 of the Chapitos captured, tortured, interrogated, and killed 2 Mexican federal law enforcement officers. Later that same year, he and others captured 3 members of a rival cartel, Los Zetas, and tortured them using electrocution before killing them. Also in 2017, court documents allege he and others conspired to kill and retaliate against a separate witness and informant. In 2022, he and another cartel sicario allegedly tested the potency of their fentanyl by injecting it into a woman repeatedly until she overdosed and died. That same summer, he and associates sold fentanyl in Los Angeles that was later seized by the DEA. By the time the 2023 kidnappings occurred, federal prosecutors in New York were already building a case against him. The confidential source feeding them information was a central part of that investigation. When Perez Salas learned the identity of the source, he organized a response that went far beyond killing one person. In October 2023, his sicarios kidnapped the DEA confidential source along with 10 other individuals in Mexico, including at least 1 U.S. citizen, all of whom Perez Salas believed were either connected to the source or had knowledge of his operations. According to the indictment filed in the Southern District of New York, Perez Salas and his men killed 8 of the 11 people they abducted. Among the dead were the DEA confidential source and a 13-year-old boy. The 3 survivors have not been publicly identified. Mexican authorities arrested Perez Salas in Culiacan, Sinaloa on November 22, 2023, approximately 1 month after the kidnappings. He was 32 years old at the time of his arrest. The operation to detain him involved coordination between Mexican authorities and U.S. law enforcement agencies, including the DEA and FBI. He was held in Mexican custody while extradition proceedings were completed. On May 25, 2024, Perez Salas was extradited from Mexico to the United States, one of the most significant extraditions of a cartel figure in recent years. He faced two separate indictments. The first, filed in the District of Columbia by the Criminal Division's Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs Section, charged him with cocaine and methamphetamine importation, firearms offenses, and conspiracy to obstruct justice through murder. The second, filed in the Southern District of New York, charged him with leadership of a continuing criminal enterprise resulting in the deaths of numerous victims, including the DEA confidential source, fentanyl importation and trafficking, obstruction of justice by murdering an informant, kidnapping resulting in the deaths of 8 people, including the 13-year-old boy, firearms offenses, and money laundering. The continuing criminal enterprise count in the Southern District indictment carries a mandatory minimum sentence of life in prison. Attorney General Merrick Garland said at the time of the extradition that Perez Salas was responsible for the murder, torture, and kidnapping of rivals and witnesses who threatened the cartel's criminal enterprise, and that this included killing a DEA confidential source. FBI Director Christopher Wray described him as the primary enforcer of the Sinaloa cartel's ruthless security apparatus. President Biden publicly thanked Mexico for cooperating with the extradition, calling it a good day for justice. The DEA confidential source who was killed has never been publicly named. No details about who they were, where they came from, or what their life looked like before they agreed to cooperate have been released by any government agency. What the court documents make clear is that they provided information significant enough for Perez Salas to identify them, locate them, and respond with a mass kidnapping that killed 8 people to make certain the threat was eliminated entirely. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Ivan Morales, in our final case, was not a confidential source operating in the shadows. He was a decorated federal police officer who survived a cartel rocket attack, testified openly in a U.S. courtroom, received a presidential medal, and was still shot dead with his wife on a public road the moment the verdict was handed down. Case 10. Ivan Morales Corrales, CJNG. Witness, Temisco, Mexico, 2025. On the morning of April 30th, 2025, Ivan Morales Corrales and his wife were traveling by car through Temisco, a city in the state of Morelos, roughly 60 miles from Mexico City. Gunmen intercepted their vehicle and opened fire. Both were killed. The attackers fled on motorcycles to a waiting car and disappeared. Ivan Morales was a former Mexican federal police officer who had survived one of the most violent cartel attacks in modern Mexican history, spent years recovering from his injuries, received his country's highest law enforcement honor, and then traveled to the United States to testify in a landmark federal trial against one of the most powerful cartel families in the world. He was killed approximately 7 weeks after the man he testified against was sentenced to life in prison. Morales had spent his career inside Mexico's federal police force during one of the most dangerous periods in the country's history, the years when the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, known as the CJNG, was expanding from a regional organization into a national force that would eventually rival the Sinaloa cartel for territory, firepower, and influence. The CJNG is led by Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, known as El Mencho, a man who carries a $15 million U.S. government bounty on his head and who has never been captured. By 2015, El Mencho had built an organization capable of open military confrontation with the Mexican state. On May 1, 2015, Morales was assigned to a covert mission in Jalisco. one of 5 military helicopters sent on a secret operation to capture El Mencho. The CJNG anticipated the raid. El Mencho's son, Rubén Oseguera Gonzalez, known as El Menchito, who functioned as a senior operational figure in the cartel, mobilized the organization's armed forces. Cartel gunmen set up roadblocks across Jalisco and engaged security forces in multiple locations simultaneously. One of the helicopters was hit by rocket-propelled grenades and went down. It was carrying 16 soldiers and 2 federal police officers. 9 of the 18 people on board died. Morales survived the crash, but crawled out of burning wreckage, having sustained 2nd and 3rd-degree burns across 70% of his body. He underwent 15 reconstructive surgeries over the following months. The burns left a significant portion of his face permanently disfigured. In December 2015, then-President Enrique Peña Nieto awarded him the Police Medal of Merit at a national ceremony. Photographs from that day show Morales standing at attention in uniform, his injuries visible, receiving the decoration in front of a packed arena that gave him more than a minute of standing applause. El Menchito was arrested in Mexico in 2015 and extradited to the United States in 2020. Federal prosecutors in Washington built a case establishing that he had personally ordered the helicopter attack, that he directed cartel forces throughout that day's confrontation with Mexican security forces, and that he was responsible for the deaths of at least 9 people in that single operation. He also personally shot and killed at least 2 other people and ordered subordinates to carry out additional murders, according to the prosecution. In September 2024, a federal jury convicted El Menchito of conspiring to distribute cocaine and methamphetamine for importation into the United States and using a firearm in connection with a drug trafficking conspiracy. Morales traveled to the United States and testified during that trial. He described what had happened on May 1, 2015, from the perspective of a man who had been inside the helicopter when it was shot down. His testimony was among the evidence prosecutors used to establish that El Menchito had ordered the attack. On March 7, 2025, a federal court in Washington sentenced Rubén Oseguera Gonzalez to life in prison. 7 weeks later, Iván Morales and his wife were dead on a road in Morelos. The Morelos State Attorney General's office opened an investigation and did not rule out revenge as the motive. Politicians and analysts in Mexico drew the connection immediately and publicly. The CJNG had demonstrated before that it was willing to target people associated with prosecutions of its leadership. The organization had been designated a foreign terrorist organization by the U.S. government in February 2025, a designation that reflected its scale, its firepower, and its willingness to use both without restraint. El Mencho, whose son was now serving life in an American prison, had the means, the motive, and the documented history of ordering retaliatory killings. No arrests have been made in connection with the murders of Iván Morales and his wife. No group has claimed responsibility. Morales had no witness protection after testifying. He had no armed escort assigned to him once the trial concluded. He returned to Mexico, where he lived without the kind of security that a man in his position, a decorated officer who had survived a cartel rocket attack and then put the cartel boss's son in prison for life, might reasonably have expected. The Mexican government that had awarded him a medal a decade earlier provided him nothing to keep him alive after he did the hardest thing the justice system asked of him. He was 10 years past the day the cartel first tried to kill him. He had rebuilt his body through 15 surgeries, buried 9 colleagues, stood in a U.S. courtroom, and told the truth about what he had seen. The CJNG waited until the verdict was in and then sent motorcycles to a road in Morelos. 10 cases, 10 people who cooperated with law enforcement against some of the most powerful criminal organizations ever to operate in the Western Hemisphere. Some were agents, some were lawyers, some were ordinary witnesses who answered federal agents' questions at their front door. What connected all of them was the moment they became known, and what the cartels did the instant they found out. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.